Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We're going to let a few more people in.
All right, Katie, are we going to get the slides at the end of the session? Or should we take notes?
Hey, Lionel, good to see you. We can post these slides if Alyssa, Walter, and Andrew are okay with that, but this will also be recorded and posted on the Housing Toolbox.
All right, thank you.
All right, I think we'll get started. What do you think, Katie? All right. So welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Bossy. I'm on the community assistance team at MHP. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Katie Lacey, who will be giving us an intro, but I just wanted to go over some housekeeping items so we can all know how we want to run this session. So just a few things on your control panel at the bottom of your screen. You can like mute yourself and unmute yourself. You came in muted, but later we really want this to be interactive. Share your thoughts, ask questions. So you can unmute yourself there. This is being recorded and will be posted onto the Housing Toolbox site. And I think you already got a message about it, but just in case, if you don't want your face to be shown, you can shut your camera off. And then for questions, we're going to wait to after each participant has gone through. So be sure to post any questions you have as we're going along in the chat. And then Katie Lacey will be fielding some questions after each presentation. And if something comes up during that time, you can raise your hand, which your virtual Zoom hand, which you'll find in the control panel at the bottom. If you click on participants, you should see an option to raise your hand. So then, other than that, I can show you at the end how to save the chat, just in case there's any good questions and answers that come up in there. But otherwise, message me if you have any questions, and I'll hand it off to the other Katie to kick us off. So thank you all.
Yeah, hi, we're really excited. This is the first in a series of the Western Mass Rural Housing Conference, which was scheduled for last April, as you all know, but was postponed due to what we all know about COVID. But it also kind of follows up on several years of MHP's involvement on this topic. Including preparation of a white paper way back in 2014 addressing rural housing issues that ultimately led to the establishment of the Rural Policy Advisory Committee, which has recently issued a fantastic plan addressing the really peculiar issues facing rural communities and identifying some good solutions. So before I introduce the speaker, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. So we're with Mass Housing Partnership. Katie's going to put on just a quick overview. We are a quasi-public agency created by state statute in 1985. And our main goal is to increase the supply of affordable housing. We work closely with municipalities and community members to help them try to think of better ways to make housing happen. And just in terms of how we're organized, we are a fairly small agency, about 50 people. We have a community assistance team in which Katie and I are members. We do permanent financing for affordable rental housing, and that's kind of our bread and butter. And we run the One Mortgage program, which provides first-time loans to eligible home buyers. And we have the Center for Housing Data, which provides a lot of great research on housing data to support policy efforts. So if you have any questions about MHP, you can get in touch with us now. But I wanted to introduce now a topic near and dear to my heart, which is zoning for housing diversity in small towns. And this is moderated by Alyssa Larose, who is the Senior Land Use and Natural Resource Planner at the Franklin Regional, Alyssa, you're gonna have to help me out there. At FRCOG is what I always call it.
Franklin Regional Council of Governments.
There you go. Okay, Alyssa, I don't know if you want to share your screen and get us started.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So I'm going to facilitate the discussions today. I'm going to start off just with a brief introduction on zoning and housing, kind of the why we're here and talking about this today. And we'll have some really great presentations from a few different towns in Western Massachusetts. So we'll hear from Andrew Groff, who's the planner in Williamstown, and Walter Ramsey, who's the planner in Montague. And then I'll finish with a presentation on some work that the Town of Buckland Planning Board is currently working on to try to meet housing needs in their town. And then before we go into the intro, I think Katie Bossy wanted to do a poll. So Katie, do you want to bring that up to see who we have on the call today?
Sure, I'll launch it now.
Okay.
You all can take just a minute to fill out who you are, get a sense of who's here. Right. Almost done here, and then I'll share our results so we can all see who's on the Zoom call. All right. Looks like just about everyone. So I'll stop the poll. Show you guys real quick. So it looks like we have mostly nonprofit organizations, town boards and committees. And we have several people from Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. We have representation from our RPAs in the region and a little bit of everything else. All right, so I will stop sharing and hand it back to you, Alyssa.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, that's a really good kind of cross-section of folks who are here. So let's see here. Oh, I have to close this. There we go. So Katie Lacey mentioned the Massachusetts Rural Policy Advisory Commission. And they, last year, pre-COVID, so it seems like a long time ago, but last year, the commission came out with the Massachusetts Rural Policy Plan, which covers, sorry, hang on. Which covers a whole range of issues relating to rural towns in Massachusetts, which is actually quite a few towns. And kind of the biggest overall challenge that we're facing in rural areas are some demographic trends that have been hard to reverse. And these include slow or declining population growth, an aging population, and kind of the challenges that that brings with providing healthcare and services, but also housing, difficulty in attracting or retaining younger workers to fill jobs, so to have our employers help them fill the jobs to keep the economy going. We also have a lack of racial and ethnic diversity in many of our rural areas. And we're seeing that foreign-born residents, which is really driving the population growth in other parts of Massachusetts, are typically not moving to rural areas. So it's kind of contributing to the lack of population growth overall. And these trends have a real impact on rural areas, as we've started to see more and more of over the years. We've lost schools. Some of our towns have had to close their elementary schools, or closure of hospitals. Our property values tend to be lower and stagnant, and that can be really tough from a kind of fiscal point of view, because we rely a lot on residential property tax revenue. Again, fewer workers to meet the needs of businesses in our region, and just a greater need for services to meet the needs of the aging population. The map just kind of highlights the population trends overall in the region. Franklin County is highlighted because that's where I work, but you can see Berkshire County and some of the surrounding counties obviously either declining or not growing much in population. And it includes the counties to the north of us in Vermont and New Hampshire, just to point out that oftentimes we have more similarities with some of those more rural areas than we may have with Eastern Massachusetts. And it's important to think about that when we're talking about policies and funding programs for our area and what might work for us and what doesn't work. So how does this all relate to zoning? Well, so when we're thinking about zoning for housing, we just talked about all these demographic trends that are difficult for our region, and yet our zoning doesn't always work in concert with our housing goals, and often is actually an impediment to housing. And that also ties into, you know, this current discussion, which really has obviously been ongoing for years, of racial disparities and racial justice across the state and the nation. And these are just a couple of examples from recent documents that touches on kind of the history when you think about housing and zoning, and how that really ties into racial segregation and perpetuates it, and whether or not zoning was put in place in areas to be exclusionary, you know, whatever the reasoning was at the time isn't really the point. The point is that, you know, zoning continues to perpetuate some of these injustices and issues. And so it's important to look at it from that lens as well. And I also sometimes get the question about, well, if we have a declining population in rural areas, why are we talking about more housing? But there is a need for housing in rural areas, and it's somewhat cyclical in terms of the issues. Currently, we have a mismatch between the housing that we have and the housing needs of residents. And this ties back to some of the changing demographics. We have a lack of affordable housing, as our wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living. And again, we have a lack of investment in affordable housing development that partly has to do with policies that don't always work for us. And then also we have an old housing stock. And so over time we're losing units because they are in need of a lot of work and can't be lived in anymore. So there's obviously a lot of challenges we face in rural areas regards to housing. Zoning is not the only solution, but it is something that we have control over as communities. We can change our zoning regulations so that they support the types of housing that we want to see instead of preventing it. And so today we're going to hear case studies, again, from Williamstown, Montague, and Buckland about some zoning work that has been ongoing now for a while, and you'll get to see some successes and lessons learned, and hear about the process that these towns have been taking to try to move forward with meeting their housing needs through zoning. So I'm going to pass it off to Andrew. Let me just introduce you. Andrew, if you want to share your screen.
Sure.
And then I will introduce you. I'll do stop share. 1 second. So Andrew Groff, sorry, I'm trying to get to my bio here. Here we go. So Andrew Groff is the Community Development Director in Williamstown, serving since 2014, and he has worked for the town's planning department in other roles for over 13 years. Andrew is a certified planner through the American Institute of Certified Planners, and he's a graduate of the University of Vermont and holds a Master's of Public Administration from Vermont's Norwich University. So Andrew, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks to MHP for putting this on. I'm going to share kind of our lessons learned over the past 5 years or so in Williamstown in terms of our work on housing policy. So for those who aren't familiar with Williamstown, we're tucked way up here in the far northwestern corner of the state between Vermont and New York. About 7,500 people live here. 2,000 of those are Williams College undergrads. We have a selectman strong manager form of government with an open town meeting, and we are so happy to be the home of Williams College and the Clark Art Institute. And those are also our two major employers, and they really dominate the economy in our region. Our political environment, we have high participation, but I'd say selective in certain demographic groups. Our residents, as you imagine, it's an academic community, very opinionated, frequent meeting attendees, real strong commitment. Particularly, we have people who've lived here for decades, and they're very committed to preserving what they see as their own vision of the community. Much fewer participation from renters, younger families, which I think is common across most of our communities. As our demographics are changing, that's becoming more of a challenge. Interestingly, in recent months, this is really starting to change. With COVID, we've been using Zoom for our public meetings here in Williamstown, and that's really dramatically increased our participation in town government, particularly from other groups that can't necessarily come to a meeting at town hall at 7 o'clock at night. And I think that's just something we should be aware of and try to learn how we integrate these technology tools, even as we come out of COVID. It could be a real benefit. So getting back to housing, our housing needs, like Alyssa was saying, it is interesting where our population's declining regionally and locally, but that doesn't mean we don't need housing. Our household sizes are decreasing dramatically, and what we're seeing is a bit of a housing mismatch starting to develop. And interestingly, we were identified in the most recent countywide master plan from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission as a high priority zone for housing, because we are a net importer of labor. We have high performing schools, and we have water and sewer service that has a significant amount of excess capacity available. So we can, as opposed to some rural communities, we can handle increased density. So if you look at our kind of overarching picture, we're a much more expensive community than our neighbors, which creates an interesting dynamic, and we're heavily owner occupied. And we started to really understand how this mismatch was forming when in 2013, in response to losing a significant chunk of affordable housing at the Spruces Mobile Home Park, which had been lost in flooding from Tropical Storm Irene, we had a housing needs assessment done. It really showed a need for more market rate rental units, particularly to a mix of households and some subsidized for lower incomes, and for subsidized elderly housing. We've been working with the not-for-profit Berkshire Housing Development Corporation in Pittsfield, and we've done great work on developing elderly housing, and we have underway a project for low income and moderate income affordable, but this market rate piece has been a real challenge. And that really became apparent to our planning board in the middle part of the last decade, started seeing much more significant numbers of Williams tenured faculty and staff retiring, and that's kind of paused at the moment, but that trend's really going to start to accelerate into this decade. Williams is really focused on recruiting younger faculty for these positions, and they're also focused heavily on diversifying their faculty and staff, which is a really great goal. However, younger generations and more diverse folks many times have less housing needs than in the past, and just simply don't have the resources to purchase an expensive single-family home in Williamstown, which is the vast majority of our housing stock. There's a need for folks to be able to rent when they come here. And all of these factors have really placed a heavy stress. The college does have a faculty housing program, but it is difficult. It is overburdened at times, and it's starting to impact their ability to recruit top talent. And a really interesting piece of gaining some hard data on this was back in late 2015, early 16, when we, after many years and many failed attempts, we finally were able to complete with the Groff companies out of Boston a wonderful mill redevelopment in our downtown. A former wire mill was converted into 48 high-end market rate apartments, and it included 13 moderate income units. There's additional development with new construction ongoing down there right now. But the remarkable thing was this was fully leased out in under 3 months from completion, which I think something that that wasn't thought to really be possible in Williamstown. And interestingly, our other major employers in the region, like the General Dynamics facility in Pittsfield, Berkshire Medical Center, Southwestern Vermont Medical Center, are also trying to recruit younger folks and experiencing similar retirement challenges to Williams. And we have folks living at Cable Mills now that work at those regional employers that were attracted to this because it's unlike anything else in the Berkshires, which is a really interesting observation. So the planning board have been doing great work ongoing throughout the last decade, completing implementation work on our master plan from the early 2000s. And there was one major unfinished item for that, and that was zoning for compact smart growth in our village core. And the planning board decided to really, after seeing these trends unfold and watching Cable Mills be leased out, that this was the time to tackle this and complete implementation. And they did create a mission statement before they began, and I think I can't emphasize enough how important this is to ground your work, no matter what size planning project you're doing. And this is just a snippet of our mission statement, but I think it encapsulates really what we were trying to do. And let's just read it briefly. With the cooperation of our friends and neighbors, the board hopes the town can institute forward-thinking and unique zoning changes to respond to broader changes that are occurring while protecting what makes Williamstown a unique community. So we started creating strategy with that as our guiding principle. Looking at our project area, a mile radius, so thinking walkability around the college campus, that's what we're talking to real estate agents and seeing that's what the desire was from folks. And we targeted district local technical assistance from our RPA, our regional planning agency, who I can't recommend enough that you work with your RPAs because they can understand the regional context of where your community is in relation to its broader environment. BRPC saw an opportunity to connect us with Mass Housing Partnership's community assistance team. So we met with the community assistance team, and they quickly hired Jen Goldson to help, a consultant out of Boston, to help us plan our community outreach. They worked with us to launch a co-urbanized, which is a great platform based out of Cambridge, to help create additional methods of feedback, thinking towards we really need to get more people involved with this. And that was part of our broader outreach goals. Co-urbanize, it was really interesting. It didn't have as much impact as we'd hoped for, but it was impactful and we gained good feedback from it. I think at the time, it might have been a slight mismatch with a place like Williamstown that values its small town ethos, those close connections. You see people downtown at the coffee shop, the library, the post office, people really value that in Williamstown, and I think they weren't ready necessarily for so much web-based interaction. However, I think the pandemic might have changed that, probably permanently, but we shall see as we go into the future. One of the first things we did was we held an open house in winter at our local youth center, which was really well attended. Bunch of workstations with, if you completed these workstations, there was different giveaways from local businesses. We really got great feedback from this. It was congenial and it was a happy environment. People responded to a visual preference survey, got to learn a lot about the different eras of construction and architecture in the neighborhoods around the college. We also had a workshop later that spring as kind of a follow-up. And unfortunately, this was an interesting one. This was unfortunately coincided with the first day in April that was sunny and 70 degrees. So I think that we lost some participation because of that. But that's just, you know, that's how things fall out sometimes. But we did get 15 folks and got some additional good feedback from that as well. And some of our lessons learned from this process. Results of our visual preference survey were incredibly helpful. This idea of adaptive reuse, some of our larger historical homes was very popular. So were accessory apartments. So were mixed use buildings like we have in our village core. And that guided us to some favored potential zoning amendments to start unlocking the marketplace for market rate housing. Lessons learned, these workshops and the use of co-urbanites did definitely invite a more thoughtful and reasonable discussion. Educating people on what their zoning is now and how that impacts housing was critical. Integrating web-based solutions does require a lot of back-end work, which I think is important to understand before undertaking it. Turnout, still difficult to achieve. Even with a full court press on marketing, our participation was still, unfortunately, less than we'd hoped. So taking all that back to the board, we started looking at how we would do a new set of zoning amendments to respond to this. We looked at the different areas of construction in the neighborhood and broke the neighborhood down into its different dimensionalities, which also represented different use profiles. We had come up with a new map, new dimensional standards, new multifamily units, regulations based on essentially what the built environment pre-World War II was. We're trying to unlock that and let it evolve in a way that it had been previously 75 years ago. Also in this proposal, which was very popular at our outreach sessions, in-law apartments to be allowed, or accessory dwelling units, as they're also known, by right throughout the community. So our process from there, the planning board kept meeting, refined its work. Board members throughout this time were meeting with different community stakeholders to make sure that that they were on board. Feedback and participation in public meetings was strongly encouraged. We received a ton of local press coverage, and we continued that marketing push that we did during our workshops. But the interesting thing was at this time, we didn't have a lot of participation in our meetings. We heard quite a bit of positive feedback through correspondence. And, you know, we had at our meetings a handful of folks who had been opposed to this throughout the entire process. But ultimately, what occurred is the vote to send these articles to our select board for consideration for the warrant did pass unanimously. But then things started to change. Once they were presented to the select board, a public hearing was scheduled for April, and the select board was unanimously supportive as well. However, then their next meeting, there was an overwhelming crowd that showed up to oppose the effort. Our planning board decided a special meeting was needed to hear out some of these concerns. And because of the overwhelming response, we actually ended up at the public hearing, tabling all these amendments and removing them from the warrant. However, I think the meeting was positive because everyone in that room agreed to stay engaged in the process. And of course, I think some of the planners and the planning board members on our call today will recognize some of this. The criticisms were what we expect. You know, a lot of distrust of renters, people saying, oh, if you're going to encourage rental units, well, those folks aren't going to care as much about our neighborhood as people that own. And then that delving into how property values could be affected. A real distrust of developers was also really interesting, and a concern that allowing more multifamily housing will exacerbate inequities, potential inequities in the community. So these were all things that we really had to internalize and help try to respond to as we moved into our next phase. And really it took retrospect to really understand kind of, well, what happened here? How did this unravel? Well, essentially what it was is the planning board lost control of its narrative on this issue. We lost control of the story and underestimated some of the folks that were consistently in opposition to the proposal. They began spreading information in ways that was unknown to the board through social media, through neighborhood canvassing, and really, we fundamentally didn't understand the development fatigue. Williams has been investing heavily, as well as the Clark, in their facilities for the last decade. And I think a lot of folks in town are feeling a change fatigue from that, and the amount of construction and just how different the town is looking because of some of those developments. And that was not well understood. And I think the use of some of the false information spread through social media and other avenues, it exacerbated that fear and brought it up. And now, moving forward, we understand that that's something that we need to more proactively manage and deal with. So how did we take all these lemons and turn them into lemonade? Well, the planning board re-engaged everyone that was opposed to these changes. Individual leaders in neighborhoods identified themselves, and we started working that summer on figuring out what can we do. And there was an agreement that a small incremental change was something that needed to be pursued. And by right accessory dwelling units was what the board settled on. So then we went about more public participation and new forms of engagement to try to get this implemented. The board adopted, and this I think went a long way to building additional trust in the planning board and really helped engage the community in a productive way. Every Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning, every other week, the board adopted a community coffee series where 2 board members, so just shy of a quorum, so no open meeting law issue, would meet at a rotating set of coffee shops or other venues in different neighborhoods, from the diner in the working class neighborhood to the coffee shop that's next door to the college to the Dunkin' Donuts, to meet people where they are and just talk about anything, any issue that might be of concern. And I think that was really important and really helpful. We also engaged the Commonwealth's Housing Choice Program and Chris Kluckman at that office for educational resources, including having Chris come out and host an informational session on ADUs, which I think was really helpful as well. And that just great plug for their office. If folks are looking for other resources, in addition to your RPAs and MHP, Housing Choice Program is also an excellent resource. And we also made, I think, much better and more extensive use of our own website. We focused on co-urbanize with the other project, but we did more work with our own website this time and made a point to strongly push back on the false information that was out there in the community or on social media and try to just keep directing people to the correct resources. Also, finding community partners, continuing that outreach with prominent members of the town, other boards, opinion leaders, etc. And I think what really can't be underestimated is this preparation for town meeting. Some communities, ours has quite a large gap between when we usually close our warrant and we have our town meeting. Having individual board members take that time to do their own outreach, talk to members of the community, talk to those opinion leaders, and help everyone understand the issue. And I think that type of outreach, a lot of these individual conversations is what led to the ADU proposal passing town meeting by an 80% margin, which after the previous year was a real surprise and I think a great outcome for the town. And we're already seeing some new construction. There's been 3 building permits issued for these units so far in 2019 to now, and that's just a drop in the bucket because with our real estate market now, a lot of interest in folks leaving the city and coming to smaller towns. We're seeing a lot of inquiries from prospective buyers and real estate agents about building accessory dwelling units. So small change, but you add that up over time, it can have a big impact. So now I'll turn it back over to Alyssa.
And Katie, did you want to take a few questions for Andrew
Sure.
at this point, or?
This is, oh, Katie. I am thinking we should probably just go to the next speaker and move the questions to the end because time is moving and
Yep.
I jotted them all down.
Okay, so Walter Ramsey is going to be up next. Walter, if you want to share your screen. Walter is the town planner in Montague, Massachusetts. He's been there now since, I believe, 2010. And he graduated with a master's in regional planning from UMass Amherst. And he's also a certified planner through the American Institute of Certified Planners. So welcome, Walter.
You muted, Walter.
If we can.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry about that. Thanks, everyone, for attending this and MHP for hosting us. So the town of Montague is located in Franklin County, next to the city of Greenfield. And we are about 30 minutes north of UMass Amherst, which is the largest employer in town. So Montague has had a stable population, going from 1970 to the present, even projecting forward to 2030, we're give or take 100 people on either side of that. So it's about as flat as it gets. Half of our residents are located in what the state defines as an economic justice neighborhood by income levels. So they're located in the two largest villages in town, Turner's Falls and Miller's Falls. So there's some wide gaps in kind of economic diversity in the community. Montague is, compared to some of its neighbors in the county, relatively more both economically diverse as well as ethnically diverse. And Montague's, we don't have much of a strong housing economy here. We typically have about 3 to 5 new single family housing units built per year, just to give you a sense of the type of growth that we have. We're popularly known for the book mill. Books you don't need in a place you can't find is their tagline. So we're a little bit off. We don't have any major highways going through town. But it's a great place to live. So note about Montague Governance, we are a representative town meeting, unlike Andrew and Williamstown, where they had an open town meeting, about 160 members, I think is the maximum amount. We have a select board and a planning board that's appointed by that select board. I, as the town planner, as town staff, I work, I'm hired by the select board, work for the town administrator, but I staff the planning board. And Montague is really a village, town of 5 villages, Turner's Falls, Miller's Falls, Montague City, Montague Center, and Lake Pleasant. Each have their own very unique identities, needs, and makeup, as they're shown on our town seal as the 5 villages. So some notes about Montague's housing stock. We have an old, diverse housing stock, as many of these rural communities do. Montague carries, punches above its weight in terms of the amount of renters that are located in town, because we have 2 old mill villages in Turner's Falls and Miller's Falls that have a lot of old worker housing for the mills. A lot of that has been converted over to rental units. So in the village of Turner's Falls, we have almost 75% are renters. And in Montague, we recently fell below our 10% goal of having affordable housing units under Chapter 40B. So we're currently at 9.5% affordable housing units. And of those units, they're all concentrated, mostly concentrated in our village of Turner's Falls. Again, an old mill town where buildings were converted to affordable housing. There's always a steady supply of older buildings to be repurposed in town. Because while that population is flat, we still don't see the amount of demand for things. So in the 10 years I've been in Montague, We've had an elementary school close. We had our last paper mill closed. We've had our Fair and Care Center, our local hospital, recently announced that it's closing, and 3 churches have closed. And big role what I play is trying to figure out what to do with these old buildings as they, as they need to be repurposed and reused. And we try to head that off before they become blighted structures, which sometimes they do get away from us. In Montague, there's an excess capacity in both water and sewer infrastructure. Our sewer system was built out to support the mills that are now closed, and we are looking at some major capital costs in the future to keep that system upgraded. So we actually need to bring in more users to help support and bolster our infrastructure, our sewer system. And we're seeing trends of older residents in town. They're wanting to age in place. They're not wanting to move elsewhere. So they, people don't necessarily want to leave Montague. We are seeing the younger population want to locate here, as well as retirees who are attracted by the low housing costs and a relatively decent quality of life, living in near a nice downtown. So in Montague, we're seeing things head in a direction that's positive. So before the recession, most of our units were single family housing units, 86% in the 5 years before the last recession. And then since that, around 2010 to present, actually the majority of our units have been what we define as infill units. That includes accessory dwelling units, new multifamily units, 2 families, things like that. We've been able to add 51 infill units to the housing stocks in our village centers. And most of that's been through not zoning per se, but through municipal initiatives. Again, repurposing of old buildings that I had mentioned, and sale of municipal property for housing use. So things are heading in the right direction, but we did learn that sometimes our zoning was getting in the way and working against initiatives that the town was supportive of reusing mills, for example. And virtually everything in Montague, the way our zoning was written, you couldn't do anything without a special permit. And in general, our town is pretty permissive with the special permits, but it was an obstacle in the way of housing. And the planning board really highlighted this as an issue and something that we could work on as a community to help us keep going in the right direction. So Montague, our comprehensive plan hadn't been done since 1999. It's still sitting there, but we've in the meantime, we've done a new housing plan, and we have an open space and recreation plan and a downtown master plan that are all current. And each of these plans, they all call for certain updates to the zoning. It falls around 4 general categories. Montague wants to protect its farmland and scenery. They want to guide development to our existing villages, and we want to remove barriers to the retention of our diverse housing stock that we already have, as well as enable growth of our commercial industrial base in specific areas in our industrial park, for example. And I highlight remove barriers to retention of diverse housing stock because that's really the focus of what today's discussion is. So we were able to build off all the existing planning that we had done to propose some zoning changes. So in 2016, the planning board directed me as the planner to do a comprehensive review of the town zoning bylaws, which were adopted in 1974 and were updated incrementally. There are about 20 different updates that were made over at the time. And the formatting was a mess, and it referenced state laws that no longer applied. So it really warranted a whole comprehensive overview. And so zoning, housing was not the only focus that we were working on. We were working on creating just a general document that was workable, but we were able to incorporate some some housing related issues into this zoning rewrite. So the planning board directed me to develop bylaws that are clear and concise, user-friendly, streamlined, importantly to reflect current laws, and lastly, guided by current town plans. And that's where we were able to pull in some zoning for housing diversity. Unfortunately, the select board wasn't able to grant a budget for this. They basically gave the thumbs up to the planning board and myself to go through and propose some zoning changes, but we're not going to be able to help you out financially. So bylaws were drafted using staff time, and we were able to work with the FRCOG, Alyssa's agency, to draft several different sections of our zoning bylaws using direct local technical assistance. And that was hugely helpful to be able to access their expertise. And of course, we did use our town council to review any of the proposed zoning changes. So as a matter of process, the planning board took the lead on the zoning reform. It took 15 meetings, and the planning board meets monthly. So it was on their agenda every month, and it made for some long meetings, but they were able to take on the process and make it work. We held 2 different public information sessions that were well attended, and we held 2 public hearings because of the breadth of the scope of the changes that we're looking at. That included, 5 hours of different testimony, a whole bunch of written comments, and then stakeholder coordination was done through myself and the planning board. It basically meant me pounding the pavement and going to all these different town boards and giving kind of tailored presentations as to how the zoning changes might affect what's under their purview. And also going to meet with different non-governmental organizations, business associations, social groups, church groups. This is where it helped to live in the community and be part of the community for a number of years. A lot of both informal connections and just, being able to be invited to community groups. That was really the extent of our outreach. And of course, we did a press campaign in our local weekly paper. We're lucky to have a local weekly paper for our small town. And that was hugely helpful in getting information out. I would write some updates and describe what the changes are, as well as some well-respected community members would also participate in a weekly column. And then in February 2019, it was brought to town meeting for approval. Again, it was a representative town meeting. We were able to pass it with a 2/3 majority. It took 2.5 hours of discussion. We had a special town meeting specifically to address zoning. We did not try to tack it on to an annual town meeting, so we gave it its due time and consideration. So our toolbox for housing diversity, these are 7 different elements of our zoning overhaul that kind of relate to zoning diversity. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just give you a sense of what they were. So Montague did pass an open space residential development bylaw. This is also known as cluster zoning for new subdivisions. This is something that a lot of communities have already done and have been doing for many years. And it had been listed on our to-do list in all of our municipal plans for going back the last couple decades. Montague just never been able to pass it. And so as part of this zoning overhaul, we were able to tack on an open space residential development that worked for Montague. So finally we did that, check that box. Not that Montague has subdivisions. We haven't had a subdivision in over 25 years, but it's there as a tool should we need it. We also passed planned unit development bylaw to allow for master planned mixed use developments in certain districts in town. Again, we don't know if that will ever be used based on our growth patterns, but it's there as a tool for the future. Again, specifically to encourage mixed use developments. We did do some changes around our accessory dwelling units, and we've reduced dimensional requirements for parcels that are within our village centers that are serviced by water and sewer. And then we found some places where multifamily and 2 families were either restricted or prohibited, and we eased the restrictions there. And then we looked at our pre-existing non-conforming properties, of which there were many, almost 90% of our houses of our properties in a residential district were pre-existing non-conforming. So we did some minor tweaks to make it easier to do changes to those properties, to add in a dwelling unit or to change the footprint even. And lastly, this is an example of a very minor tweak, but it has important implications. Existing mobile homes were prohibited in Montague, and mobile homes from the 1970s, as they need to be replaced. The current standard of mobile home is larger than they were in the 1970s. And so we're seeing for somebody to replace a mobile home, they need to get a variance to replace it on the same footprint. And that was being a barrier to, we were seeing them coming out of use. And we just want to make it easier for people to replace mobile homes. Unfortunately, they're still prohibited in town, but at least we made it easier to replace them. So quick note about the accessory dwelling unit section of the bylaw. What we had, they were previously allowed, but they were all by special permit, and they were capped at a maximum size of 700 square feet, and they were not allowed as to be detached from an existing unit. And so we did some tweaks where we were able to allow them by right when they're within an existing structure. And we now allow them by special permit if you're going to expand your structure to have an ADU. And we can also allow an ADU in a detached unit from the house, be that in a garage, a barn, or a completely separate outbuilding, where else that was previously prohibited. And so I would have liked to have gone completely by right, but the community wasn't there. And as the board didn't want to push this issue, we were going to revisit on another day, but we definitely made it easier to do ADUs by giving a path to by right ADU and to allow detached units by special permit. We also increased the maximum size of these up to 900 square feet. And this was all based on concrete examples of people wanting to do units that were greater than 700 square feet repeatedly, and also wanting to do detached units, which it just wasn't allowed under our zoning. It's about reducing our minimum lot size standards. So in our old regulations, an additional half acre was required for each additional dwelling unit. So if you wanted to do a 3-family, you needed to add an extra acre of land to your parcel. And that applied to all parcels, even if you were on water and sewer. So it really disincentivized development in our village centers. So it was kind of maybe even an editorial oversight, but it was making even places where you could do a 2-family by right, you still needed a special permit for lot area relief. So there really was no way you could do multifamily by right in Montague. So we were able to go in and fix that issue. We did not add any additional lot size requirements if you're on water and sewer, because again, the town wants to encourage growth on properties that are on water and sewer. And we were able to use an example of a school that we had redeveloped that had closed on 2 acres that was 22 units were permitted in it. So it needed to get, it would have needed something like 11 acres under the zoning. And so they had to get special permit relief from 11 acres down to 2 acres to have 22 units. And it was just, it was silly to see that requirement and in the heart of a village center to say that you needed 11 acres to do this project. That project was appealed by abutters. We ended up winning the appeal. Project got built and everybody loves it. And so we were able to point that to it as a success. And then we went through and eased use restrictions and prohibitions on multifamily units in town. So we took a look at a village like Montague Center, where the book mill is, traditional New England village center. 2 families were allowed by special permit and multifamilies were prohibited. But there were 2 families and multifamilies everywhere in that village. So we were able to rezone it to allow 2 families by right and multifamilies by special permit. So again, just a tweak there. In our canal district, shown below here, it's a bunch of mills on the edge of the village of Turner's Falls. All these mills have since closed and they're vacant for redevelopment. Residential was prohibited in the zoning. We were able to change it to allow multifamily by special permit. And then in our typical residential districts, multifamily was just prohibited outright. And now they're allowed by special permit. Again, there's places where I would have liked to gone farther, but we proposed changes that just made sense and we could point to in existing planning documents. So the results since 2009, we've had some positive results. Since passing these bylaws, we've been able to permit 3 new 2-family homes. So one of those was done by right. 3 multifamily units have been able to add a 3rd unit on unused top floors. So we found that our zoning was prohibiting people from developing the third floor of 3-story buildings. And people have been converting those to new units, which is a good sign. We've permitted 5 accessory apartments. 2 of those have been by right. And then we have a new 14-unit mixed-use building that's been proposed in downtown Turners Falls. And on top of that, there's been 6 new single-family homes. So again, we're kind of continuing with that trend of more infill type housing units, more of that than single-family homes. And as I noted, there was a lot more that we wanted to do, and so we have a kind of a future agenda list of things that we would like to get to, and that includes an inclusionary zoning bylaw that would ensure mixed income for new developments, at least a certain percentage of, especially since Montague is now below its 10% affordable housing threshold. That would help us get back to that 10%. We want to consider doing all accessory apartments by right. We want to allow 2 families by in all residential districts. That was considered to go a little bit too far and beyond the scope of what we were going to be able to do for the zoning overhaul. And then lastly, the planning board is just beginning to consider the idea of doing form-based codes of the village center. That's a zoning code that regulates by building form instead of use. And that's a way to help encourage more housing in a way that fits the character of the community. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. That was really great. I'm going to move right along and do a brief presentation on the work that Buckland's been doing so that we have time for questions afterwards. Let me just share this. So as mentioned from earlier, I work for the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and we serve as the regional planning agency for Franklin County towns, all 26 towns. And so part of that role is helping towns like Montague with zoning revisions. And a lot of our towns do not have town planners like Montague does. Montague's lucky to have Walter. And so this example is from the town of Buckland, which the population is just under 2,000 people, and they have an all-volunteer planning board. And so they don't have town planning staff, which is very common for most of our towns that we work in. And so this is just one way that regional planning agencies can help towns with work moving forward on some of these initiatives. So this is just a background of Buckland. You may know it as Shelburne Falls, which is technically just half Buckland and half the town of Shelburne, but that's it's off of Route 2 in western Franklin County. And it originally was a key Native American fishing ground. Later, it grew up as an agricultural community, and then later as an industrial center on the Deerfield River. And so these are just some images to give you kind of an overview of what Buckland is like today. Again, the village of Shelburne Falls is on the left-hand side here and on the top picture. But then outside of the village area is very rural, and there's farmland and forests. Again, in terms of demographics, Buckland does kind of mirror the larger regional demographics in terms of a declining population. It's a slight decline, nothing major. But you can see here that even with population declining, the number of households, which is there's 1 household per housing unit, has increased. And that has to do with the smaller household sizes over time. And the total number of housing units hasn't kept up with that increase. We also see in Buckland, as well as in other towns in this area, a large large percentage of existing residents who are cost burdened by their housing, so they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. This is a greater percent of renters fall in this category, but also homeowners. And also the housing prices, at least for single family homes, far exceed what a household who's earning the median income in the town could afford. So there is an affordability issue and a gap in our region. There's also very few vacancies, and this was touched upon, I think, by Andrew in Williamstown. Again, because of the lack of housing development and the changing demographics, there's actually very few vacant housing units out there. And the ones that we do have are either for seasonal use or are vacant because they can't be lived in. They need to be rehabilitated. So Buckland started this process back in 2016 by creating a housing plan. The planning board kind of was the group that spearheaded this, but also brought in, there are other members from other boards and residents who participated in creating the housing plan. A survey was done as part of that planning process. And generally there is interest in supporting different housing types in the village area. And the needs that were developed, that kind of came out of that planning process, both by looking at the data and the survey results, were for senior housing, housing for first-time home buyers that's affordable, rental housing, as well as housing for persons with disabilities. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly so we have time for questions. So the zoning process to date, in 2018, actually FRCOG, my agency, was awarded a planning assistance grant from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to work with Buckland as well as a few other towns on zoning related to housing. We began meeting in 2019 with the Buckland Planning Board to kind of review what the recommendations were from the housing plan. The planning board was really interested in getting some more information and more feedback from the community to really see what might be supported and desired in terms of zoning changes. So I've been kind of working on that with them, and we'll show you a few of the examples. In October, the board hosted a public forum to gather initial feedback, and there was a really good discussion that came out of that. And one of the main requests was to understand, well, what would these zoning changes look like in Buckland? So in response to that, we created some development scenarios that could illustrate what those changes might look like. We planned a second forum in April, but that was canceled due to COVID-19. So right now we're just picking back up on the process and hoping to move forward with different ways of gathering public feedback. So just to situate you on what Buckland zoning looks like, they do have a village district that encompasses the area that is served by water and sewer. And the rest of the town is mostly residential agriculture. And so the potential zoning changes that Buckland has been considering include changes to their accessory apartment bylaw, smaller lots in the village zoning districts, and as well as some modifications to their cluster or conservation development bylaw, both in the rural areas as well as in the village. And so some of the background research that the board wanted me to look into was, well, what are the existing dimensions in the village, and how do they compare with what the zoning is requiring? Right now, the zoning requires 20,000 square feet, which is just under a half acre, for a building lot, and 100 feet of frontage along a public way in order to build a new house. And so I went out and walked the streets in the village and took photos, and then also used GIS mapping to get a median lot size and frontage for different streets in the village. And so the combination of the photos and then the actual, measuring of the lot sizes was combined to help show how existing development patterns don't match, for the large part, don't match the zoning that is placed on top of it. So this is just an example of one of the streets where the median frontage is 66 feet and the median lot size is 8,700 square feet, which is obviously a lot smaller than what is being asked for in the zoning. And same thing with this street. And then this street was actually a newer development, somewhat newer in the village, that does meet the current zoning. So it's just like illustrating the differences in terms of the development patterns and what it looks like. So this was another piece of the information provided to the board about, just based on lot sizes, over half of the, or almost half of the lots don't conform to today's zoning. So you couldn't build the village today in the same way. It would look totally different. And so one of the things that they're considering is reducing the lot sizes. And the outcomes of that would be increasing the opportunity for some new housing, some new infill housing that could be closer to the historic development pattern in the village. So again, the options that the board is looking at are here. And again, the feedback was, what will these scenarios, what would this zoning potentially look like? So the next step was to find actual examples in the village, actual lots in the village that we could show what this zoning might do. And so we used a few examples from planning board members, which was really great. And then one that was a town-owned parcel. We needed to get willing participants. But this is just one example of accessory apartments. This is an existing single family house. It has a large enough lot where you could put an attached or detached accessory dwelling unit, which right now is not allowed in Buckland. And this is the visualization of what that might look like. We do have a detached accessory dwelling unit example as well. I didn't include it because it's kind of similar to this example, which is the individual lot infill, where you actually create a new building lot from an existing lot. So it's a subdivision. And this would only be possible if you allow for smaller lot sizes. And so this is the visualization from that. Another example that we looked at is a cottage development scenario for the village, which right now also isn't possible under the current zoning. This is actually their police station site, which isn't necessarily where something like this would happen, though maybe. The idea isn't to demolish existing buildings to build new, but it was a site that we could use to illustrate what could happen. And so the idea with the cottages are that they're smaller homes, there's common space that's shared amongst them, and shared parking. And so this was the visualization for that scenario. So the next steps are try to reimagine how public outreach will go because of COVID. How are we going to gather input on the visualizations? We're thinking now of potentially posting them on the town website with some polling questions and try to, give people time to react to them. And then moving forward, of course, drafting and revising zoning changes with plenty of public information sessions and public hearing process. And they will require town meeting approval. And then also something that has come up with not just Buckland, but other towns is providing some informational materials about what has changed after the fact so that residents are aware, so that they're aware that now they can put an accessory dwelling unit in and this is the process that you go through, things like that. So, because not everyone is always, paying attention to all the town meeting articles and things like that. So that's the process that Buckland has been going through. And this is our contact information. And now I don't know if Katie
Yeah,
or Katie Boss, you want to take over with questions?
sure. We're coming right up on it.
Yeah.
But we had a few questions. I'm going to just we really only have a few minutes. Andrew, there was a bunch of questions about the public outreach process. One was, what was the turnout like for the coffees? And then two sort of related questions, what kind of false information was being spread, and how did you combat that or address it?
Well, the coffees thing was part of combating the false information. And I'd say the turnout started off really strong and was also dependent on how busy the venue they chose was. Particularly, actually, the Saturday morning ones were really helpful at getting new people to participate in the conversations. And the false information really ran the gamut from just distrust of the landlords who already own rental property being given more ability to develop additional units, to the things that were just wildly crazy, like, oh, this is a secret plot by Williams College to expand their campus, which isn't true. And trying to combat that, board members and the town's own social media presence were engaging people there more often, engaging people in person with the coffee sessions. That really helped, but it didn't. I mean, I'll be honest, it's really hard to combat these alternative facts, especially in this day and age. People want to believe what they want to believe, and it's very, very difficult. So we didn't have an easy answer.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Now, are ADUs allowed by right or special permit after?
ADUs are allowed by right if you're on parcels or within buildings, converting existing buildings that already comply with zoning dimensional standards. If you don't, you have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So of the ones we've seen done so far, we did do one via special, we did two via special permit, and we've done one by right. And I think we'll probably be doing at least two more building permits for by right before the end of the year.
Okay, I'm going to quick turn to Walter. What an amazing accomplishment. But a question came in, how many units of the new ones that were created were low income units?
Yeah, so
I assume the question was restricted.
Yeah. Only two of them were restricted Habitat for Humanity houses. Of the 51 units over the last 10 years, two were restricted, which has made the town go from just above its 10% quota to just below it. So our goal is to add some more units so that we can get to that 10% affordable housing quota. I know that 11 of those units were for a transitional housing agency, and they aren't deed restricted, but they certainly are helping serve a wider need of affordable housing. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. And then just one last question back to Alyssa. A question came in, can other communities, are FRCOG resources available to towns similar to Buckland to revise their zoning bylaws? So I don't know, let's close out with that one.
Yes, absolutely. So obviously, if you're a Franklin County town, the Franklin Regional Council of Governments planning staff is available. We actually just got a 5-year grant that will allow us to work with towns on zoning related to housing in a more sustained fashion. So we don't have to always, apply for separate grants here and there or find money to do it. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk. Also, just if you're in Berkshire County or if you're in Hampshire or Hampden County, your regional planning agencies are a great resource. So Berkshire Regional Planning Commission or Pioneer Valley Planning Commission are good resources to reach out to. Yeah.
Since we are trying to keep our deadline here, we're going to close out now, but thanks for all the presenters. This was fantastic. So much information. And here's the contact information. You can also reach out to Katie Bossy or myself at MHP. So Thanks again, everyone, for coming, and thanks to the presenters.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thank you.
so much.